Well, welcome everybody. On behalf of Cultural Vistas and the McCain Institute for International Leadership, thank you all for joining us this evening. We're really glad to see such a wonderful turnout. I'm Rob Fenstermacher. I'm the president and CEO of Cultural Vistas, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our co-host and partner for this event, the McCain Institute. This nonprofit to-do tank is dedicated to advancing character-driven global leadership based on security, economic opportunity, freedom, and human dignity in the United States and around the world. The Institute seeks to promote humanitarian action, human rights and democracy, and national security, and to embrace technology in producing better designs for educated decisions in national and international policy. And one example of that is that we're live streaming this evening. So we're glad that a lot of people who couldn't be with us in person are actually able to participate from afar, if you will. It's in large part due to the McCain Institute that one of our panelists this evening, Mr. Hafiz Rehmatullah, could be with us today all the way from Pakistan. Let me also provide a brief introduction to Cultural Vistas for those of you who may not be familiar with all of our work. We're a nonprofit exchange organization that promotes global understanding between individuals around the world and promote collaboration amongst individuals and institutions. And we develop a variety of international professional experiences that allow people to become engaged citizens and more informed, thereby empowering them to become change agents for themselves, for their institutions, and for society in general. And so we feel like we play a very important role in bringing people together to look at important global issues. And over the past year, Cultural Vistas has worked to establish a new, robust alumni relations initiative that engages alumni from across our portfolio of programs and supports them throughout their career development. Every day, we're continually impressed with our alumni and the leadership they display in understanding and tackling cross-border challenges like human trafficking. This is why the new alumni discussion series has already become so important to us. This showcase highlights our alumni's remarkable accomplishments and shares their deep expertise with our community of friends and stakeholders and all of you here this evening. Future topics will include women's entrepreneurship issues, disability rights, and sustainable cities. So please keep your eyes open for future events and future invitations, and hope you'll be able to join us for that. And many thanks again to my colleagues at Cultural Vistas and the McCain Institute for organizing tonight's event. Tonight's topic is an extremely important one. We know that human trafficking occurs in cities all across the United States and in other developed economies. Yet too often, we ignore the signs that modern-day slavery is taking place just across the street and in our very own neighborhood. Greater public awareness is needed to call human traffickers to account. And in fact, we too in the exchange community really have an important role to play in putting a stop to human trafficking. As a Department of State designated sponsor of the J1 Exchange Visitor Program, we're aware that there have been unfortunate cases when short-term work visas have left individuals, some cases in the short-term holiday programs or au pair programs, vulnerable to exploitation. While we offer J1 Exchange Visitor Services to international interns and trainees, which is a different category of the J, we know that the privilege of being a State Department designated sponsor really carries an enormous amount of significant responsibility. And as such, we work very closely to scrutinize applications and the host organizations where all of our participants go to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of our international visitors while they're in the United States. And these are duties that we take incredibly seriously, and we've worked closely with Polaris and Safe Horizons in the past to provide training to our staff so that they are better aware and able to identify potential problem cases. So with this, it's now my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. First, Mr. Hafiz Rehmatullah, who's an alumnus of the United States Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, and Cultural Vistas is one of the 7 national programming agencies for that program. After a year, when he took the study tour here back in 2014, he was able to come back, and he's now spending another year as a next generation leader at the McCain Institute. And so we're really happy that we have this opportunity to have you here in the United States to chat with us this evening. To his right is Dr. Danielle Johnson, Danny, who is a regional manager at Polaris, which was previously the Polaris Project. And she's an alumna of the Alpha Fellowship Program, which is a program that sends emerging leaders over to Russia for 6 months to a year to gain professional experience. And Cultural Vistas is the US manager of that program. And while she was in Russia, she worked at Human Rights Watch. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. And last but not least, we have Mr. Andrew Bogrand, who's our moderator. He also was an Alpha Fellow in Russia. And while he was there, he also spent time at Human Rights Watch. He's now a communications and outreach officer at Democracy International here in DC. So with that, I'm looking forward to an engaging discussion. I'll turn it over to you, and thank you all for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Rob, for the introduction. And my sincere thanks both to Cultural Vistas and the McCain Institute for International Leadership for hosting this important discussion tonight. I've heard that you can join the conversation online at #EndTrafficking. We'll be taking, during the Q&A session, we'll be taking questions from Twitter. The subject tonight touches all of us in some way, perhaps in unexpected ways. Rob just mentioned the way that Cultural Vistas must seriously scrutinize its applications and address the needs of its visitors as implementers of important State Department exchange programs. Certainly at Democracy International, where I'm now affiliated, and where we work with partners around the world to advance human rights, good governance, and resilient institutions in some of the world's toughest environments, including Afghanistan and South Sudan. We recognize the alarming connection between state corruption, human exploitation, and trafficking. But you don't need to work in a fragile environment or a transitional country, or even with an international organization like Cultural Vistas or Democracy International, to recognize the scope of trafficking today. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, thousands of men, women, and children fall into the hands of traffickers in their own countries and abroad every year. Almost every country in the world, according to the UNODC, is affected by trafficking, whether as a country of origin, transit, or destination for victims. So from rural farms to urban dance clubs, from battlefields in Syria to nail salons right here in DC, research suggests trafficking cuts across ethnicity, geography, and all segments of the economy. While human trafficking is the trade in people and does not necessarily involve the movement of victims across borders, there are plenty of examples of domestic trafficking within the US alone. The crisis as it exists today is still part and product of globalization. This is this alarming commoditization of people that has been partially encouraged by freer movements and freer markets, particularly in regions like the former Soviet Union. In this sense, the problem of trafficking requires a truly global response, built on international cooperation and partnership, not only between government agencies and law enforcement bodies, but also between academia, civil society, and business. Solutions to trafficking, however, I'd like to state, also require local knowledge and local context. The experience of a sex trafficking victim in Canada will surely depart from that of a child labor in a mine in Pakistan or Afghanistan. And this gets us to the question we are asked this evening: how precisely international cooperation might foster local solutions to human trafficking? The three of us, and I'm sure many of you in the audience tonight, are not only engaged with the issue of trafficking itself, but believe in the power of cooperation and engaged international leadership to solve some of the most pressing problems of our time, from human trafficking and human rights issues to environmental change and beyond. Through the Alpha Fellowship and the IVLP, the International Visitors Leadership Program, the three of us have benefited from international exchange programs. We're honored to be here tonight and honored to talk about these subjects in greater depth. Before we talk more substantively, however, about these issues and the role of international collaboration, I'd like to have both my guests introduce themselves and perhaps briefly discuss your current work in the anti-trafficking sector. I'll start with you, Danny.
Thanks so much for moderating tonight, Andrew. So I am Danielle Johnson. I work at Polaris, which is based here in Washington, D.C. We work both domestically and globally. We are a nonprofit, non-governmental, nonpartisan organization that works on all forms of human trafficking. We work exclusively on the issue of human trafficking, and we work with victims from every walk of life. We work with men and women and children. We work with sex trafficking victims, labor trafficking victims. We work with everyone. And that gives us quite a good scope and span for understanding the issue. We run the National Human Trafficking Hotline here in the United States, known as the NHTRC, or the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And we provide training and technical assistance to communities here in the US and also overseas. I started with Polaris over 2 years ago as a global program specialist, and I was charged specifically with building up Polaris's relationships in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Polaris's global work was new at the time, and we really didn't understand the landscape. And we took a regional model. We really wanted to understand how trafficking was happening on the ground in every region of the world. So we hired people specifically that had language skills and cultural competency in every region of the world to go out and talk to people and go out and look at the research and figuring out what was happening, who are the organizations that were working on the ground, who are the stakeholders. And I did that for them in the former Soviet Union and eventually did some training and technical assistance in that part of the world. As we have worked on the whole world, we decided we were maybe a little bit too broad. So we decided to specialize a little bit more. Now we're working more concretely in our own backyard and working predominantly on North American collaboration. We still work globally in every country as the need arises, but we're really focusing on looking at how we can build coordination across stakeholders in the US, Mexico, and Canada, and also looking at building hotlines in countries like the UK and South Africa. To build a global safety net. And while we're piloting this form of coordination, which is a very difficult task in the human trafficking field, we're really looking to see what works and what doesn't, and then we will expand globally again to look at what lessons learned can be applied in other regions of the world. So while I was working strongly in the former Soviet Union, I'm now looking in particular at Canada and the UK, and at building partnerships and doing direct technical assistance. So that's sort of where I'm at, and we'll turn it over to Hafiz, who I'm very glad to see again after he was at Polaris for an IVLP. So it's a nice little reunion here, I think, for the three of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm Hafiz Rehmatullah. Rehmatullah is a much tougher name for you. It's Arabic name. So Hafiz, I'm very comfortable with that. So I'm here with the McCain Institute as a next generation leader here in DC, and I'm placed with the Humanity United. They are also working on human trafficking. And my work in Pakistan is combating human trafficking. I'm working particularly in one of the provinces in Balochistan, but now I have broadened my leadership action plan to a national level. So I worked with the law enforcement agencies on their training, their capacity building on human trafficking issues. I'm working with the legislative assembly members in our provinces and also at Senate and national levels to have a comprehensive law to combat all forms of human trafficking, including internal trafficking. And I also work with some brick kilns, victims of the human trafficking, the bonded labor and the forced labor. So I'm working on a comprehensive legislation and other forms of all forms of human trafficking. So this is my work in Pakistan, and now I'm here to learn from the US experiences here, like Polaris and other organizations. They are working on combating human trafficking efforts. So all over here just to learn more and more and to implement and good practices of the US and other part of the world to implement in my country and to improve the situation of human trafficking in Pakistan. As you all know, maybe that according to global slavery index, Pakistan placed is second highest slave in the world in South Asia. So it is, the human trafficking and slavery issues worsening day by day in Pakistan. So I need to focus more on that. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you both. So before we start, I think it's important to kind of get a sense of the scope and what exactly we mean. I mean, we're saying human trafficking, and for us, it's something that we've come to kind of define. But what do we mean? What are we talking about? What is the size and the scope of this problem? I'll turn that over to you, Danny.
Ideally, I think everyone in the field would agree that that would be an easy question with a straightforward answer. Unfortunately, that is very far from the case. Some of what we do know, we've already touched on. We know that human trafficking is a problem that spans every demographic, every industry, and every country. So every community in the world is affected by this. But we know more about what we don't know, which one of the biggest questions we face in this field is, well, how many victims of trafficking are there? We don't know. there are wildly different estimates and wildly different methodologies that have arrived at those estimates. So to give you an example, the ILO says that there are 21 million victims of forced labor, of human trafficking. The Department of State said in 2013 that there were 27 million victims of human trafficking, which was based on an earlier estimate by a scholar named Kevin Bales. The Global Slavery Index, which was mentioned by Hafiz earlier and is the product of an organization called Walk Free, which is based in Australia, they say that there are almost 36 million slaves in the world. So we're somewhere between 21 million and 36 million slaves. That seems like a wildly large gap. So there's a lot of reasons why we can't really speak well to the scope and the scale of this crisis. One of which is that victims don't self-identify. It's really, really hard for a victim to come forward and say, I am a victim of human trafficking. And that's the case whether it's somebody living in an urban area in the United States or in rural Pakistan, for example. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's shame and stigma around being a victim of human trafficking, particularly if it's happened because somebody is trying to make a better life for themselves and their family and they found themselves in a really desperate situation. People are afraid. They're afraid to talk to law enforcement. If there's an immigration situation, they're afraid they'll be deported. So they don't say, I need help. Oftentimes people don't know that they're victims of human trafficking. And some of the situations you referenced in conflict zones, people are dealing with a lot. There's a lot of different layers of trauma that are happening, and they may not be aware that what they're experiencing is trafficking, as opposed to other issues related to migration, other issues related to gender-based violence. And so it's really hard to separate out trafficking when it's really happening. There's also serious definitional issues with trafficking. When we talk about trafficking, oftentimes we're talking about different things. What does trafficking encompass? Is it forced labor? Is it sex trafficking? Is it both those things? Is forced marriage part of human trafficking? Is international adoptions, when those go horribly wrong, are those forms of trafficking? We have all kinds of debates about this in the field of what actually constitutes trafficking, what should be labeled trafficking, what is slavery versus trafficking? Is one worse than the other? So if we're all talking about different things with different definitions, it's really hard to say, this is the crisis that we're facing, this is the scope and scale of it. What we do know is that all traffickers are operating a high risk or a low risk, high profit enterprise. And they are operating undeterred. And that is the case in every country of the world. So that is what we really need to think about, the networks of traffickers, and really starting to take that perspective as we work out some of these methodological and definitional questions that are making that question so difficult to answer.
So I'll turn this over to you, Hafiz. I'm curious to kind of build on what Danny's saying here. I mean, you know, we had talked beforehand about kind of the difference between sex trafficking, labor trafficking. I'm certainly no expert in Afghanistan, Pakistan, but I am familiar that there is major issues with labor trafficking in Pakistan, in the region, particularly with the brick making industry, and you mentioned that earlier. I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate a little bit on what is the kind of forms of trafficking that you're seeing in Pakistan, which you're working on, and maybe also, you know, what's your take on labor trafficking? How is that materializing in Pakistan?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, whenever you talk about the people, particularly about the human trafficking, so it's come to sex trafficking, but it's not only a sex trafficking. I mean, it's labor trafficking as well. I mean, the force begging as well. The child marriages, we have contradictions in our laws. I mean, some of the provinces in Pakistan, they are allowed to marry a child from 13 years, and some other provinces they're not allowing the children to marry on below the 18 years. So there are, I mean, contradictions. And when we talk about the labor trafficking, just only in Punjab, in Sindh province, we have more than 15,000 bricklins, and each bricklins contain 200 to 250 people in one bricklin, and half of them are children and women. They are living in bonded labor and forced labor situation over there. I mean, millions of people are suffering from that slavery situation. People are working in agriculture, in coal mines, and thousands of people. I mean, if when we come to the point of the data, Danielle talk about the estimation of the number of the human slavery and the trafficking victims and the survivors. I mean, US and the other all developed countries, they still are lacking of the data. If you talk about the Pakistan, I mean, we are nowhere. the issue is still unidentified, unrecognized, and our government, I mean, if you come to the responses side, if you talk with the government officials and our law enforcement agencies, they are responsible to deal with this issue. So they are nowhere. When you talk, yes, they will talk about some cross-border trafficking. When you come to the internal trafficking, so they totally denied, and we don't have any issue internally with the labor trafficking and the force banging, the child labor. I mean, it's worsening. I mean, thousands of people are children are working in labor situation, the worst form of the labor situation in Pakistan. I mean, when we talk about the children and the young boys recruiting and as a young soldiers, and the Taliban they are using, it's uh, I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, just in a few days back, one attack was on the university in Pakistan, Charsada. They got killed 20 people in that attack. In 2014, it was attack on our one of the school. So most of the suicide bombers, they were 16, 17, 18 years old. So this is, I mean, how they are deceiving the young men and the people, the human traffickers, to utilize them, to use them on human suicide bombing, the target killing. So it's worsening, and it's day by day. Yes.
Thanks. So, so if I'm understanding correctly, then what you're implying is that, especially here in DC, where the focus has been for so long on, or for so long recently, at least on ISIS or Islamic State and these other extremist movements in the region, are you saying? I mean, is there a connection between kind of fragility and failed states and extremism and trafficking? You know, what is that connection? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely highlight that issue, because it's our own issue and we have to talk about that. In Pakistan, I mean, people are avoiding this issue about particularly about the Taliban and some anti-state elements in my province in Balochistan. I mean, they are recruiting young men and children to fight with the state and the Taliban. They are, I mean, I studied one of the madrasa in my province. I was also the part of that madrasa. I lived there for 4 and 5 years, so I'm very familiar that how they are deceiving young men and children. I mean, I was so fortunate that I left that life, and now I'm here to serve for my people, particularly the vulnerable people of they are suffering from the human trafficking issues and slavery. So I mean, they are deceiving young men, people. There are thousands of, even if I could talk, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, young men and children. They are studying over there, and most of them, they are. I mean, it's a very easy target for them to deceive them and bring them to that life. And yeah, it is.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
There's a couple of things I would say on that point. We are thinking in the field, I think, a lot more about the relationship between trafficking and conflict. As you mentioned, data is a huge problem in this field to begin with. When you bring a conflict situation into it, things are even more chaotic and more difficult to understand. The expectation is that conflict will foster human trafficking. It makes sense that people would be extremely vulnerable to this issue when faced with conflict. These are often, as particularly when you're talking about IDPs and refugees, people that are fleeing their homes, their livelihoods, that have been brutalized, that have witnessed violence. They have so many vulnerability factors for human trafficking. But the fact of the matter is, as much as we speculate, we just don't know. We don't have the data. And for lots of the reasons I mentioned before, people are already afraid. They're experiencing so much and have so many layers of trauma, and they just might not know that what they're experiencing is trafficking. So here's a huge need for data that we're identifying in the field. That being said, with this need in mind, we need to be very careful to avoid conceptual stretching in the field, as far as I'm concerned, because we already have definitional inconsistencies across the field, across countries. This is often reflected in legislative inconsistencies, both in the ways laws are defined between even regions and states, but also the way that they're implemented. So when we're thinking about who can be considered a victim of trafficking and who that definition of trafficking can apply to, when we're talking about, for example, people that have been recruited to ISIS, we need to be very careful in terms of how we define what makes them a human trafficking victim. And that's a very new area of research. So it'll be very interesting to see how that conversation evolves as well. So thank you for highlighting that. I think it's an important point.
But just to clarify, so outside of the conflict zones, I mean, you had mentioned that you're working a lot in Canada, North America. I mean, it's a very different environment. So what are the similarities? What are the differences? When we talk about trafficking in the United States or in our neighborhood, it's a concern, obviously. But what are the differences, or can you kind of elaborate on that point?
Sure. I think that there are, in some respects, the similarities between countries is more important, at least in the experience that I've had. I worked on the ground quite a lot in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union before moving into Canada and the UK. And the conversations that I've had have been remarkably similar with actors on the ground. And it's typically people saying, and these are service providers, these are law enforcement agencies, these are government stakeholders, and they're typically saying, we're working really hard, but we don't know who else is out there. We feel like we're working in isolation from the rest of the field. We feel like our resources are really underdeveloped. We get cases all the time that involve other countries, other international nexi, and we don't know who to reach out to. We don't know how to handle it. And that's really the need that we have seen at Polaris in our global work. And so what we're really trying to do is connect countries and connect stakeholders across borders, because although the industry might be different, although the legislative framework might be different, I think in general people are facing very similar macro, bigger picture items in figuring out how to provide services to victims as needed, how to make sure that law enforcement are sensitive, particularly in the realm of sex trafficking, where there's a real temptation to say that person's just a prostitute, why should I help her? The question of how to make legislation that's actually implemented. These are all issues that are being faced at some level or another, no matter how developed the country. So I've seen remarkable consistencies, even if the industries that are affected might be different or the populations that are affected might be very different.
So that's a nice transition, and to get away from the problem and start maybe talking about some solutions. I'd be curious to hear, and I'm sure the audience would as well, what's working? This is something that's obviously it's a terrible crisis and quite large in scope. But Hafiz, what have you observed from the field that's working? What are the kind of things that we need to be investing in and pursuing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I will talk on Pakistan situation because I'm working over there. So first of all, I think the collaboration is, I mean, the national, the regional, and the international collaboration, it is missing. I mean, when we come to the part of the human traffickers, they are more organized and collaborative than us, the people who is working on that. I mean, it's very unfortunate. I mean, if we talk about the data, if you talk about the law enforcement side, I mean, they don't know, they don't have. So if I talk in Pakistan issue, I mean, we don't have a comprehensive law to combat all forms of human trafficking, particularly the internal trafficking. Currently now we have just presidential ordinance, it was in 2002, and it's just catering a cross-border trafficking. So no, I mean, we don't have any law at national level or at provincial level to cater all forms of human trafficking. And if we come to the law enforcement agency, the FIA, or Federal Investigation Agency, who is the male dealing agency with the human trafficking issues. I mean, last year when I was here in US on IVLP program, we met with the Homeland Security person, when some FBI guys. I mean, they accepted that yes, our people, they still, the issue of the human trafficking is still unidentified among the personnel. They still don't know about. I mean, they are more to learn about the human trafficking issues. When it comes to the Pakistan, I mean, they are nowhere. Our law enforcement agencies, FIA, if I talk about the police, and the levies, one of our tribal law enforcement agencies. So there is no sensitization and awareness of the issue among the law enforcement agencies at all. And when we come to the general masses, I mean, around 16 million children are out of schools yet still in Pakistan. So it's a huge number, and they all are vulnerable and at risk of being the subject of human trafficking. So we also need to reach there. I mean, human trafficking is still an unidentified issue among our parliamentarians, our law enforcement agencies, and the vulnerable, even the victims. I mean, they still cannot recognize that, yes, we are in this situation of the human trafficking or slavery. So this is, I mean, we need to have a comprehensive law at national and provincial level, and the training of the law enforcement agency. And one thing more, I mean, the learning from my previous US visit was that in Pakistan, we don't have a network or alliance of like-minded people. Like here in the US, I mean, Humanity United is working on ATAS, Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking. You have some alliances in Denver, some state-level alliances. In Pakistan, we don't have a forum of the like-minded people to sit together and to talk about human trafficking issues. After that, I mean, you can work and you can improve the situation of human trafficking. So in my leadership action plan, which I have submitted to the McCain Institute, I have included that I'm going to form a human trafficking alliance in Pakistan, because we really need that alliance of the NGOs, people from the government side, people from the law enforcement agency. They need to sit on one table and to discuss and then to come for the solution of the issue. So this is also a very dire need in my country particularly, and it was a learning from my previous year, the Polaris and the other organization which I learned, and now I'm aiming to improve the situation of human trafficking in my country.
And Danny, to build on that, Hafiz mentioned the kind of the importance of collaboration, of learning here on this exchange program. I'm curious, you know, in your own professional background, to get more personal, what have you taken from your exchange background, from your from your work abroad, or what do you see that's working in terms of international collaboration? We say partnerships, we say collaboration, but you know, I'd be curious too, is what do we mean, and how do we go about going about doing that?
Well, I guess I will start from the broader level in terms of what's working internationally in the field. One thing I would say, and I'm a little bit biased because Polaris runs a national hotline, but I think hotlines are working. What we've seen from our experience here in the US is that hotlines become a fabulous coordinating mechanism for a country. And what they are able to do is they're able to collect data about how human trafficking is happening on the ground in real time in a particular community, whether that's a national community or a smaller regional community. When you have a trusted hotline in a country, you have a resource for victims that makes them feel like they can call, they can tell their story, and they will not be judged. They will be provided resources. They do not have to give their name. If they don't want to, they will be safe. The same thing goes for friends and family members, for community members that want to report tips. If that hotline is a trusted resource, people are going to call it, and people are going to give crucial information, and we're going to build up details about cases of human trafficking. And we're going to be able to work with partners on the ground, like law enforcement, like service providers, and really connect everyone in the network in that community to make sure that victims are getting the support that they need. When we have that data, we're able to see, like I said, a bigger picture of what's happening in the country. But now what we're doing is taking things a step further. So what we're really trying to do is make sure that there's a strong functioning hotline in every country of the world. The next step is making sure that all of those hotlines are talking to each other, that they're sharing strategies, they're sharing resources, they're sharing best practices. And most importantly, that they're sharing data. It's a really, really, really big ask because of data privacy laws, which are draconian for good reason in a lot of different places. But one of the things we've been able to do is take our technology for managing the data that we have coming into our hotline and actually give it to other hotlines around the world. What that means is we're standardizing data collection across countries. It means that we're collecting data on the same variables, we're asking questions and doing assessments in the same victim-sensitive, empowering ways, and we're sharing experiences about what's working and what's not. And at the end of the day, we're starting to build up this map of how human trafficking looks across the entire world instead of in just one community. So that's one mechanism we're really seeing that's working. So we're building towards this world where we're sharing data between countries because traffickers cross borders, so why shouldn't we? Your point about traffickers being smarter than us, unfortunately, is so true. So we really need to take technology and leverage that to our advantage in the same way that traffickers are doing. So that's one solution that really comes to mind. On a more personal level, I've seen the Alpha Fellowship impact my career and my ability to make an impact on this issue in really significant ways. The biggest key for me was learning the Russian language. And I would not have been able to work effectively in these countries without speaking Russian to a professional level. And a few people in this room can attest to the fact that my Russian was pretty terrifying before I went to Moscow. I mean, it was functional at best. So actually living and working in Moscow and being placed in situations where I had to fumble my way through and I had to learn the vocabulary and I had to learn to communicate with actors that were making a difference, that pushed things forward for me and gave me the cultural competency to be able to guide my organization in a really effective and really sensitive way and really understand how things work in a country that can be extremely closed and can be extremely dangerous for people to work in. So I'm able to have the expertise now after that experience. That means I can have an impact in a way that I wouldn't be able to do without it. So definitely all for international cooperation on the personal level as well.
Well, thank you both. I think what I'll do now is turn this over to the audience for questions. And also, if you're following us online, you can use the hashtag #endtrafficking. And I think we're going to take some questions from Twitter as well. But thank you both for your insights. And I'm going to turn this over. Does anyone have any questions to start with? Yes, in the back. And if you could introduce yourself and maybe say where you're from or who you represent.
First of all, forgive me for being late. My name is Christine Vargas. I am the marketing director at Control Vistas Americas. And I focus on compliance, forensics, and intelligence so that companies that do business in all kinds of environments are in compliance with the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. It's been coming up in the conferences that I've been going to that human trafficking is becoming a compliance issue for certain companies, especially companies in the travel sector. And there's been some wonderful initiatives inside of corporations to educate their employees when they're seeing human trafficking happen and what to do in response. And there's also some movement behind getting legislation to enforce or force companies to really pay more attention to this if it's a sector where this is happening quite a bit, as I said, in travel. What advice do you have for the private sector on this issue? What industries do you think need to start jumping up and down and shouting for stronger international regulations to force companies to really keep an eye out and do something to combat human trafficking?
Do you want to take it?
Sure.
Thank you for your question, and I think it's a very topical one, particularly given some recent legislative developments trying to eliminate slavery in our supply chains in the U.S., and given some movement in California in particular on the Supply Chains Act. I would say that there have been really good initiatives happening in several industries, really good partnerships. The travel industry is one. The hospitality industry, there have been some really good partnerships. There is an organization called Airline Ambassadors International, which does trainings in airports throughout the world to make sure that all airport staff and flight staff are able to recognize indicators of human trafficking as they come up. Polaris has worked with them a little bit in terms of curriculum development for trainings. Polaris also works quite extensively with the hotel industry and are working with them more and more. And one of the ways, this is not so supply chain oriented, but another way of thinking about it is that this is a field that's really under-resourced. So one thing that hotels can do is provide their rooms for free. If they have training, so if shelter beds for human trafficking victims are extremely limited in the US and all across the world, and that's something actually I hear no matter what country I'm in, people are saying there just are no shelter beds. So one really good partnership is for human trafficking organizations and stakeholders to work with the hospitality industry to make sure that they're able to provide their resources for free or at cost. Southwest Airlines is another organization that provides flights to help victims get back home. That happens in the US, and there are more and more initiatives happening to make sure that repatriation can happen at low cost as well throughout the world. So there's a lot of different partnerships that can happen on supply chains and also on other resourcing issues as well for human trafficking victims. But I think the biggest key on supply chains is to keep in mind that it really affects every type of product we're using. There is slavery in the supply chain pretty much everywhere you look, or there could potentially be. So one thing is making sure that consumers are more informed about where their products are coming from and that they're putting pressure on corporations as well. And corporations are becoming more and more amenable. I think we've seen a lot of progress from organizations like Walmart, for example, which people like to demonize, and with good reason sometimes, but we've really seen a lot of movement from them on this issue in particular, on tomatoes, for example, and making sure that there's no slavery in the tomato supply chain. So I think that putting pressure on corporations and making sure that people are aware of where their goods are coming from, but also on a more sort of political or legislative level, being sure that if we have legislation, that it's implemented. And that once legislation is passed or once loopholes are closed, we don't just stop the pressure. We make sure that we are looking at how they're implemented, looking at where inconsistencies might be. We've seen that in the recent Obama closed a loophole, which many of you may have heard of, to make sure that we cannot have goods in this country that are the product of slavery due to consumptive demand, which is a whole other controversial in and of itself. But just to make sure that just because we have this loophole closed, the fight's not over. We're keeping the pressure on. We're looking at partnerships. We're talking about ways that it might not be as easy for us to make sure that that slavery is not in the supply chain if an agency does not have the right investigative power, for example, to make sure that the product is slavery free. So really just to keep the conversation going once we think we've had the legislative victories, I think is key to this issue as well.
I will just comment. I mean, world is really now looking for that. If you talk about the Uzbekistan cotton industry, now, I mean, they are the governments of the US and the other governments that take care of your industry and make it slave free, and also the Thai fish industry. I mean, it's a good sign. If I talk about the trafficking in person report, it's also a kind of a pressurizing tool on countries like Pakistan, India, Thailand, Malaysia. I mean, they are now taking care of their trafficking issues because it's linked with their non-developmental funds. Yeah, so it is. I mean, you just need to chain and to get a collaborative approach or idea to get over there. Yeah.
I'm an attorney. I'm here in my personal capacity. This is a question for Mr. Rehmatullah. You spoke about the absence or the dearth of regional cooperation. But it occurs to me that especially for competency sharing in South Asia, in the Article 11 of the Pakistani Constitution, which prohibits forced labor and trafficking, is virtually identical to Article 34 of the Indian Constitution. You have the same kind of overlap between both countries' bonded labor abolition acts. Perhaps the Criminal Procedure Code and the penal codes, to the extent they're inherited from the British, are very identical. This seems like a great place for UNODC, Polaris, anyone who's willing to talk to each other, understanding, militarized border and all that, to share best practices and how do you train the police? How do you rehabilitate victims? How do you trace a trafficking hotline, even if you're willing to cite cases on denial of bail or upholding convictions? Do you see any movement towards regional collaboration when you've got kind of a shared legal system?
Well, honestly speaking, I mean, there are some UN organization, UN ODC is working at Islamabad level, and some other ILO is working on labor issues. You're right. I mean, we have a lot of scope. I mean, in India, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, we have some similarities, but there is, I mean, a need of a more collaborations. Just, I mean, the bondage or the link of the human trafficking issues. Pakistan is taking care of the trafficking in person reports because they have to report to the State Department about the trafficking issues. So this is, I mean, we are lacking, yes, at national level, but also at regional level. We directly need the collaboration at our Southeast Asia level, and obviously at global level to address these issues. Yes, thank you.
Question? Yes.
A question from Twitter.
All right, great.
Yep. The question is, this is from Alex. How do you ensure victims of trafficking are aware of these hotlines? So,
Danny?
I was on the hotline buff now. Outed myself. That is an excellent question, Alex, from Twitter. There's a lot of ways, and that is probably the biggest issue that hotlines face when they are beginning and sort of evolving, is making sure how do people know the number. And this is something when we're working with new and emerging hotlines in other countries, we talk a lot about. Some of it is kind of the obvious promotion and outreach, making sure that the materials are targeted to the communities that you know are vulnerable, making sure that it's in the languages of your target populations, for example. in terms of sex trafficking, it can be really difficult because it can be very dangerous for victims of sex trafficking to be seen with a hotline number by their pimp. So there have been a lot of really interesting ways of making sure that those numbers get to people. For example, there are many women working in the commercial sex trade who use something called love boxes, which are to carry their condoms. And we actually had an initiative, or we're many years ago, worked with other organizations in Europe that made sure that the number was at the very bottom of these love boxes. And we distributed them thinking that we were distributing condoms, but really when they got to the bottom of the love box, they were able to see the hotline numbers in their countries. So you have to be a little bit stealthy when working with particular demographics. Others have put hotline numbers on bars of soap, for example, in hotels that we know are operating as brothels as well. So there's a lot that can be done in promotion and outreach, but I think there's other things that are a little bit more nuanced. For example, making sure that there is one single memorable short number that people can easily pull to mind when they need it and when it's in a difficult situation. We've seen hotlines proliferate in many countries, and that actually is detrimental when there are hotlines at the state level and at the regional level and at the national level. And when there is a hotline for sex trafficking victims and a hotline for labor trafficking victims and a hotline for children, people don't know where to call, so they just don't call at all. So making sure there's one kind of nerve center for the country. And what we've seen for Polaris is we get a lot of calls that are related issue. It's not people with indicators of trafficking, but we've built up relationships with other hotlines, for example, the domestic violence hotline, the sexual assault hotline, and we can refer these people on to the resources that they need. But we're really able to have that one number that people remember. Another advance for promoting hotlines has been texting. Lots of people text, particularly young victims of sex trafficking. So with texting, you can have a short code that's very, very quick and very easy to remember. And we've seen a lot of sex trafficking victims actually texting from the back of cars, for example, as they're being driven to the site where they're being trafficked that night or at that particular moment. So really looking at ways to leverage technology in an effective way to make sure that people are going to use the hotline is key as well. So there's a lot that goes into thinking about it more than just how do you market the number. Also, when you launch a hotline, it's always heavily marketed, and we've seen in a lot of countries it just stops after that. So making sure that these campaigns are ongoing and making sure that people are going into schools and they're going into hospitals and they're going into various industries and they're talking to frontline professionals and they're making sure that the frontline professionals and the community members know the number so that they can pass it on as needed and that the community becomes the eyes and ears for the movement. So distributing the number as widely as possible in that way as well.
I'll take a few more here. Yes.
I have a question. What would it take?
You share your name.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Ann Sarkis, and I'm a registered nurse, and I do volunteer work on human trafficking issues. And it's a good cause. I think everyone who's not trafficked should be working these issues. I have a question. What would it take to raise this issue to a very visible group in like the governments of every country? Like in this country, we raised the issue of AIDS and it was tackled and research was proliferated and we're in the midst of finding cures. The same thing with epidemics around the world. Everybody here I know has heard about getting a flu shot, right? Why hasn't everyone here heard about the human trafficking issue? It's a horrible, horrible crime against humanity. And it's an infrastructure issue because it's at every single level of every national infrastructure. And it's a global security issue at best or at worst. Either way, but what would it take to raise that to a global, raise this issue to a global level?
That's great.
Every person knew about it.
Which one of you wants to tackle that? it's an ambitious question.
Yeah.
It's idealistic, but I'm just.
Yeah, idealism is great. And human rights causes would get nowhere without idealisms. And thank you for your work. It's very admirable, and the nursing community is one of the best allies of the anti-trafficking movement as far as I've seen. So thank you very much. I would say a couple of things. One is human trafficking is having a bit of a moment. It's becoming trendy. More people have heard of it now than you can say a decade ago. There's been a lot of celebrity attention to it. Nick Kristof of the New York Times is responsible for some of that, but there has been a lot more knowledge, and I think a lot more people have heard of this than is true of the past. But with that increasing attention comes risks as well. And this goes back to kind of those definitional, those terminological challenges that I mentioned before. People need to yes, know what human trafficking is, know what the indicators are, know how to recognize it when it's happening and what to do when they recognize it. For example, have a hotline number to call. But what we have seen is some vigilantism, which is concerning, because what we really need to be careful about is making sure that victims are feeling empowered.
Governments demanding that the police arrest the traffickers. They're the criminals. I mean, is it not an international crime to traffic people? Is it not a crime in any country to traffic people? Why aren't the police arresting them? And why aren't the governments writing legislation and supporting this so it is raised to a global level?
Sure. I mean, I think
criminals, not the victims, the criminals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ideally would happen, but again, the legislative schemes that are governing various parts of the world are different. So the definition of human trafficking in the United States is different from the international definition of trafficking, which is the Palermo Protocol, which many in this room are probably familiar with. So for example, the Palermo Protocol defines organ trafficking under the umbrella of human trafficking. In the US, we don't do that. So there's sort of different, to use a legal term, burdens of proof for how you handle human trafficking victims. Often where there are human trafficking laws, it's actually easier to prosecute traffickers under different laws. Whether it's a burden of proof issue or just the way these cases evolve, we've seen people get prosecutions under related laws as opposed to the human trafficking law as well. But I think, as you were mentioning before, it's embarrassing to say that human trafficking is happening in our country, that human trafficking is happening under our noses. It's much easier to say that it's an international problem, it's happening in other countries, it's happening across borders, rather than this is a domestic problem for us. And a lot of times there's collusion, there's corruption that's involved, which is something you were mentioning as well. And it's human trafficking is profitable. And human trafficking is not well defined despite legislation. So what one person might consider a human trafficking victim, others may say differently, depending on what the industry is, for example. We see lots of debates over, in the sex trafficking field in particular, who should be considered a victim of human trafficking, and whether prostitution should be legalized, whether Johns should be considered human traffickers. These are all debates we've had at both the legislative level and sort of within the movement itself. So as these debates are going on and there's no consensus, it's very, very hard to just end trafficking. It's a really idealistic thing to do, but there are just too many inconsistencies to do it in a rational, streamlined way. So I think we're moving towards that. But there's a lot that has to be worked out, and there's a lot of benefits to trafficking as well that are, for now, insurmountable.
If I will just comment shortly, I mean, it's right. It's human trafficking and slavery is growing day by day. But the other end, if you I mean, imagine 10 years before, no one was aware about the issue here in the US, and no one talking about that. Now the people, they are talking about that. I mean, we just need to talk more and more about the issue and involve the celebrities and involve the world leaders to talk about it. Will greatly impact on the issue in the other parts of the world. It will, yeah, but it will obviously take time. I mean, and I believe, I mean, if we talk and we will talk more and more and work for that, I mean, it will not take to end this. I mean, to 70 or 80 years, we will be in a good position to end this curse from the world.
There's just one point I really quickly want to make as well. I think we really need to keep in mind what I was saying before about making sure that victims feel empowered. So the risk is that the rest of the world will say, you are a victim of human trafficking. This is what needs to happen. You need to leave your situation, and this is how we're going to help you out of the situation. Not all victims are ready to leave their situations for whatever reason. And it's not our place to say that they should, or to say how they should do it. Victims know their situations best. They know when they're in danger and when they're ready to make certain changes. So we really, it's great to think about the whole world coming together to end trafficking, but really it needs to start with that individual victim, with their consent, with them thinking through what is best for me and how am I going to do this. That way they're much less likely to be re-trafficked because they've made the decisions themselves and they've decided what's best for them based on their unique knowledge of their situation. So we can think about it at this global scope, and we should, but we also need to get very, very, very micro and think about it in terms of the victim's perspective. And from that perspective, it's even harder to end trafficking, I think.
And if I can jump on really quickly, I think from the human rights perspective, one of the things that we struggle with is how do we make these kind of specific issues relevant to a wider audience? So here in DC, when we're working on the Hill or something, and we're working with congressional leaders that might be interested in, say, fighting terrorism, we really do have to change the message to one that's interesting to them. And I think that we need to do that across the board for these issues. We can't just be talking to activists or to human rights folks, but we need to broaden the conversation to business leaders, to other folks, to make them see that there's other ramifications and that there's other costs to this that aren't necessarily just associated with victims themselves. I mean, there's a cost to business in doing this, whether it's just simply a legal prosecution case or if it's something more costly to the bottom line. Whatever it is, there's other ways of getting people compelled to care, I think. And it's tough. I don't think it's an easy answer. But I think there is reason to be optimistic and reason to be hopeful. Okay, let's take one last question. Is there anyone else?
It's a question for Hafiz, and I'm curious if there's any one perhaps particular lesson that you think you've learned from the experience you had through IVLP or through now the program with the McCain Institute that you're going to bring back after your experience in the United States?
Well, I have a lot of lesson learned from my previous visit. I mean, I was selected based on my learning from here in the US. I mean, Polaris is running a toll-free number for the victims of human trafficking. So in my leadership action plan, I have included hotline, free hotline in Pakistan. I mean, I have included to form a human trafficking alliance network over there and to conduct a national level. I mean, it will be a first ever things which I'm going to done. I mean, before that, still now we don't have any alliance at national level, at provincial level. I mean, we never had conduct a national level conference on human trafficking or at provincial level. So it all my take away from here, and particularly when I will be in the process of the alliance, because I was also the provincial coordinator of child rights movements in Balochistan. So in our alliances, we rarely involve the law enforcement persons in our. So here in the US, I learned that the people from law enforcement background, they must be the part of that alliance and their efforts. So this is all my takeaway from that learning. And at last, if you are just concluding, just I beg your pardon that I couldn't speak well in English, because English is a fourth language for me. My mother language is Pashto. In schools, we have to speak in Urdu and Arabic and then English. And I have also, yeah, it's crazy. I have also a background of madrasa. I studied, my father took me off from school and sent me to the madrasa. The Taliban and other, it's a kind of religious academy. I studied over there for 5 and 6 years over there. So from that background, I came here, and now I'm here to speak with you people. I know I couldn't speak well because of my limitations in my speaking. If I wish I could speak in Urdu and other language. So I beg your pardon for you all, and thank you so much for your time. And I really believe that the learning of the experiences of US and all other the modern world they are working on the combat efforts will definitely affect a positive create a positive effect in my country's situation. I mean, millions of people in Pakistan, they are suffering from modern day slavery and trafficking issues. So I believe together we can improve the situation of not only in my country, in my region, but all over the world, because it's a global phenomena. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to you, Hafiz, and thanks, Danny. And again, thanks to Cultural Vistas and the McCain Institute for putting this on tonight. I've been told that there's, I think we heard in the last, that the drinks are ready. So please stay around for a little bit here. The lights will be on till 8, I've been told. Thank you again for coming, and thanks again for our host. It was a really great evening, and I hope you found it interesting and informative. So thank you.